Government Order of the Day number 3.
Electronic Monitoring of Offenders Legislation Bill, first reading.
The Honourable Paseta Sam Lotu-Iiga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I move that the Electronic Monitoring of Offenders Legislation Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Law and Order Committee to consider this bill. Mr Speaker, this bill is really about improving the safety of victims and the public. It will do so by removing some of the legislative barriers in the Sentencing Act to electronic monitoring. It will make electronic monitoring available to the courts when imposing either of the following sentences as described in the bill before you. First, a prison sentence of up to 2 years with release on conditions specified by the court. Secondly, sir, it's a sentence of intensive supervision. Monitoring technologies continue to improve and give corrections and the police opportunities to protect the public from certain offenders in the community. This bill recognises the importance of this objective. Speaker, the purpose of electronic monitoring is to detect and potentially deter non-compliance of offenders with conditions that relate to their movement. The Department of Corrections uses both radio frequency as well as GPS technologies to do this. Where the condition is to remain at a specific address, radio frequency equipment has proven to create an electronic boundary and sends an alert if the device attached to the offender crosses that boundary. Now, many of these devices can now plot the offender's location by GPS. And when he or she is allowed to leave the property or does so contrary to that condition, the condition instead prohibits certain entry to certain areas related to the offender's risk of reoffending. I believe, and certainly I think it's a widely held view, sir, that GPS monitoring is more fit for purpose. The offender will wear a device around their ankle, which will send an alert if the offender enters a prohibited area. Authorities also receive an alert in the event that the offender tampers or tries to break the device or removes it from the monitoring equipment. So, sir, there's quite a strong public interest in electronic monitoring as the most timely and reliable means of detecting these offences. Breaching these types of conditions can also be a precursor sometimes to more serious offending. So electronic monitoring gives us the opportunity to intervene swiftly, ideally in time to prevent harm to the public should the device be tampered with. It also increases the likelihood of detection and this should deter the offender from committing further offences. Obviously, the benefits of electronic monitoring to the public safety, they need to be weighed up, sir, with the fact that sometimes it is an onerous intervention, and in many respects it constitutes a search and it interferes with the privacy of individuals. So you've got to balance those rights to make it necessary for that offender to wear a device. So GPS monitoring devices also need to be regularly charged by the offender at regular time intervals, which some would argue actually impinges on their liberties and their freedoms. Well, some would argue. I know you don't. Look, I want to turn to some of the legislative barriers removed by the bill, sir. So the courts currently impose electronic monitoring on, for example, bail, to verify compliance of the requirement to be at a certain bail address. They can also, impose some of these monitoring devices, namely for community detention, home detention, and they prove quite effective in those examples. But these sentences require the offender to remain at the address, which makes electronic monitoring necessary in those particular circumstances. But the courts are currently prevented from using these devices for the two populations that are clearly laid out in this bill. And I expect members across this House, certainly I've had discussions with some members in terms of the bill's genesis. I expect members to actually take up this bill and vote for it. So let's look at the two categories in turn. First, if we could look at the offender's sentenced to imprisonment for up to 2 years. So these offenders are entitled to be released after serving the first half of their sentence. But their release is often subject to conditions of release imposed at sentencing. But what we know about these types of offenders, Sir, is that they have a higher rate of reoffending. And on their release, sometimes they do recommit crimes, and recidivism is certainly one of the BPS, the government targets that I'm focused on as the Minister of Corrections. There is a subset of them, Sir, that can be managed better if they were subject to electronic monitoring. These two examples of this are, those that breach protection orders, and certainly, I've heard the debates in this House around the breach of protection orders, and I'm sure members right across this chamber will see this as an advance in the protection, particularly of women and particularly of vulnerable people who are subject to protection orders. Secondly, Sir, stalking offenders. These types of devices will limit the ability of stalkers who are released on conditions to go anywhere near their previous or their victims of their previous crimes. Secondly, we've got offenders who are subject to intensive supervision. Another highly problematic population, in my view, Sir, because they have some of the highest reconviction rates of our prison population. And it's really in keeping with the rehabilitative purpose of intensive supervision to prevent certain offenders from entering certain areas out in the public domain. For example, it may be disruptive to the progress of an offender to visit areas where they've had opportunities, say, to sexually reoffend, or areas where members of their gangs or their previous gang affiliations, where they have gang affiliations and they're prevented from going into those types of areas. Electronic monitoring, of course, would provide a pretty stern deterrence for them to enter those areas under the new rules, should this bill pass, Sir. One important detail of the bill is the requirement for the courts to, before they impose a sentence, is to take the Department of Corrections advice into account. This advice, Sir, is certainly not, it's not mandatory to take on board the advice, but certainly it will have an impact on the court's ability to hand down sentences that are appropriate for electronic monitoring. And I think this is another progression in this legislation, Sir. Just want to touch on, before I conclude, Sir, I just want to touch on the Section 7 Bill of Rights Act report from the Attorney-General. I want to offer just a brief explanation for its apparent inconsistency with this Act. We know from previous government bills that dealt with electronic monitoring that this was an issue. Certainly the Attorney-General's report focuses on the electronic monitoring component of it. It's not concerned with the policy of the bill, which relates to the monitoring of offenders and the administration of those sentences. So I'd like to, recommend to the Select Committee that they focus on Part 2 of the bill and not Part 1 in terms of the Bill of Rights Act report from the Attorney-General. So in conclusion, I want to say that the courts have a legitimate interest in requiring the electronic monitoring of offenders when imposing conditions of release from imprisonment for up to 2 years. I've laid out the reasons why. There are specific examples, clear examples, where this bill will have a beneficial impact, particularly on victims. Sir, electronic monitoring can help considerably to protect the community from the risks of reoffending, where there is a specific geographical areas that offenders should not certainly be moving into. I expect that the bill will improve the safety of victims and the general public, and that's why, Sir, I commend it to the House.